In the summer of 1945, Europe lay broken, cities reduced to rubble, borders erased, and millions displaced. History remembers the soldiers who surrendered, the generals who signed documents, and the flags that were lowered. But almost no one remembers the women who were captured after the guns fell silent. They were German women, nurses, radio operators, clerks, cooks, and support staff who had followed the machinery of war to its bitter end. Some had worn uniforms. Others had simply worked where the war demanded. When Germany collapsed, they did not go home. Instead, they became prisoners of war. For many of them, captivity was unexpected. They were not frontline fighters. They did not imagine themselves behind barbed wire, guarded by foreign soldiers, labeled as enemy personnel. Yet suddenly they were counted, processed, and stripped of identity, no longer individuals, only POWs. Their capture did not come with drama or resistance. There were no final battles, no last stands. It came quietly. A command. A line to stand in. A document stamped. And just like that, their lives were no longer their own. Rumors spread quickly among the women. Some whispered that they would be sent to labor camps. Others feared revenge. They had heard stories of humiliation, punishment, and cruelty. The war had taught them one thing very clearly: mercy was rare, and enemies did not forgive easily. What frightened them most was not hunger or exhaustion. It was uncertainty. They did not know where they were going. They did not know how long they would be kept. And most terrifying of all, they did not know how they would be treated. 4 weeks, they were held in temporary camps across Europe. Conditions were harsh. Water was scarce. Hygiene was almost non-existent. The women lived in the same clothes they had worn during the final days of the war, dirty, torn, and infested. Washing was a luxury. Privacy was a memory. In those camps, dignity slowly eroded. Hair became matted. Skin cracked and burned. Illness spread easily. And with every passing day, the women felt themselves becoming less human, less visible, like forgotten debris left behind by history. Then came the announcement that changed everything. A group of German women would be transported, not east, not to neighboring countries, but across the ocean. To America. The word sounded unreal. America was not a place they knew from experience, only from propaganda, distant rumors, and wartime myths. To some, it represented brutal power. To others, unknown danger. No one associated it with kindness. Why would America want them? The question echoed endlessly, unanswered. As their names were read aloud, fear tightened in their chests. Being sent so far away meant one thing: whatever awaited them would be long, irreversible, and completely out of their control. They were marched onto transport ships under heavy guard. No explanations were given. No reassurance offered. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, cold and indifferent. As the ship pulled away from Europe, many of the women stood silently, watching the shoreline disappear. Some cried quietly. Others felt nothing at all, emotion already drained by years of war. They believed this journey marked the beginning of something worse. None of them could imagine that one of the most unforgettable moments of their captivity would not involve interrogation, punishment, or violence, but something as simple and as human as a shower. And when that moment came, it would challenge everything they believed about their enemy, their captivity, and their own worth as human beings. The war was over. But for these women, the reckoning had only just begun. The ship did not feel like rescue. It felt like exile. As the vessel cut through the Atlantic, the women were packed below deck, rows of narrow bunks, dim lighting, and air thick with the smell of sweat, salt, and fear. The engines roared day and night, a constant reminder that there was no turning back. For most of them, this was their first time at sea. And it was not the open ocean that terrified them, it was what waited at the other end. They spoke in whispers. Not because they were ordered to, but because hope itself felt dangerous. Every woman carried her own version of the same question: what will they do to us in America? Some believed they would be put to work immediately: factories, farms, or camps deep in the interior where no one would ever hear from them again. Others feared something darker. War had taught them that women prisoners were especially vulnerable. And stories, some true, some imagined, had already done enough damage to keep them awake at night. The guards were American. Young, mostly silent, disciplined. They did not shout. They did not strike. And that alone made the women uneasy. Kindness would have been easier to understand than neutrality. Neutral behavior left room for imagination, and imagination after war was cruel. The days blurred together. There was food, simple but sufficient. Water was rationed. Washing was almost impossible. Faces became pale. Hair lost its shape. Skin itched constantly from dirt and salt. The women stopped looking at their reflections because there were none. At night, the ocean rocked the ship gently, almost mockingly peaceful. Some women cried quietly into their blankets. Others stared into the darkness, replaying memories of home, houses that no longer existed, families whose fate they did not know. A few felt shame. Not personal guilt, but the heavy collective shame of defeat. They were citizens of a fallen nation, being carried like cargo to the land of the victors. And yet, something strange began to happen. No one was beaten. No one was screamed at. No one disappeared. Days passed. Then weeks. The women began to notice small details they hadn't expected. The guards followed rules. Medical checks were conducted. Sick prisoners were treated, not ignored. It did not feel like freedom, but it did not feel like vengeance either. Still, fear never loosened its grip. Because uncertainty is often worse than cruelty. When land was finally announced, the women rushed to the deck. They saw the coastline, vast, unfamiliar, and impossibly intact. No ruins. No smoke. No scars of war. America did not look like a battlefield. As the ship docked, silence fell over the group. This was it. The unknown had a name now. A place. A direction. They straightened their clothes as best they could. Some wiped their faces with trembling hands. Others stood rigid, preparing themselves for humiliation, inspection, or punishment. They believed the hardest part was still ahead. None of them realized that what awaited them first was not interrogation, but a moment so ordinary, so unexpected, that it would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A moment that would make them question whether captivity always meant the loss of humanity, and whether even enemies could recognize dignity. When war was finally over, the moment they stepped onto American soil, nothing happened. No shouting. No violence. No chaos. That alone felt wrong. The women stood in neat lines on the dock, guarded but not rushed. The air smelled different, cleaner, unfamiliar. The buildings around them were intact, orderly, untouched by bombs. For women who had spent years surrounded by destruction, the sight was almost unsettling. This place had not suffered like Europe had. They were loaded onto trucks and buses, their movements efficient and controlled. No one explained where they were going. The guards spoke little, but when they did, their voices were calm. Orders were given without anger. Suspicion replaced fear. Surely this was temporary. Surely the cruelty would come later. The camp appeared after hours of travel. Barbed wire, watchtowers, wooden buildings laid out with precision. It looked like a prison, but not like the ones they had known. There was space. Order. Clean lines. They were registered one by one. Names checked. Numbers assigned. Personal belongings catalogued, not discarded. Medical inspections followed, not rough, not humiliating, but clinical and methodical. Some of the women could not hide their confusion. They were given barracks, actual beds, blankets, and enough room to move. Windows let in light. The floors were clean. There were latrines with running water. Running water. For a moment, no one spoke. Their expectations had prepared them for brutality, not structure. For neglect, not organization. The contrast was disorienting. It felt like walking into a story that refused to follow its own rules. Still, they remained cautious. Food was served. It was plain but warm. And there was enough of it. No fighting. No desperation. No scraps. The women ate slowly, unsure whether to trust what was in front of them. Some saved pieces of bread, hiding them instinctively, habits formed during years of scarcity. That night, sleep came unevenly. The camp was quiet. Too quiet. No distant artillery. No air raid sirens. Just the sound of insects and wind moving through trees. For many of them, this was the first silent night in years. And silence, after war, was not comforting. It was suspicious. The next morning, orders came again. Short. Clear. Translated. They were to be taken to the washing facilities. The word passed through the barracks in uneasy murmurs. Washing meant inspection. It meant exposure. It meant vulnerability. In Europe, showers in camps often preceded punishment, delousing, or worse. Women had learned to fear such instructions. Some tightened their jaws. Others felt their stomachs turn. They followed the guards anyway. The building they were led toward was larger than expected. Steam rose faintly from vents along its roof. The smell of soap drifted through the air, light, clean, almost unfamiliar. The women exchanged glances. Soap was not something you noticed during war. It disappeared early, along with comfort and dignity. They stopped at the entrance. Instructions were given. Come. Precise. No shouting. Still, their bodies tensed. They braced themselves for humiliation. What they did not know, what they could not imagine, was that behind those doors waited not punishment, but the first moment of care they had felt in years. A moment so simple, so human, that it would leave them standing in silence, unable to believe what was about to happen next. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. For a moment no one moved. The room was large, bright, clean. Pipes ran along the ceiling and rows of metal showerheads lined the walls. Steam hovered in the air, warm and real. This was not a processing room. This was not an interrogation chamber. This was a shower room. The women stood frozen, unsure whether this was a mistake or a test. Years of war had taught them that kindness often came with conditions. They waited for shouting, for guards to rush in, for laughter or cruelty. None came. Instead, instructions were given calmly. Towels were placed in their hands. Soap, actual soap, was distributed. Not ration scraps. Full bars. Some of the women stared at it as if it were fragile or unreal. They were told there would be privacy. That word landed heavier than any command. Privacy had vanished long ago, from bomb shelters, crowded trains, field hospitals, camps. Bodies had become public objects of survival. Dignity had been something you remembered, not something you lived. Water began to run. Warm water. Not cold. Not rationed. Not timed to seconds. It flowed freely, filling the room with sound. The women hesitated, then slowly stepped beneath the streams. And something broke. Dirt, sweat, and months, sometimes years, of grime began to wash away. But it wasn't just their skin that reacted. It was their faces, their posture, their breathing. Some women closed their eyes and did not open them again for a long time. Others pressed their foreheads against the tiled walls, shoulders shaking silently. No one spoke. Tears mixed with water and disappeared down the drain, unnoticed and unjudged. This was not about cleanliness. It was about being treated as human. The soap smelled unfamiliar, clean, almost gentle. Hair softened under their fingers. Skin stopped burning. For the first time in years, their bodies were not simply surviving. They were being cared for. A few women began to cry openly. Not from fear but from release. From the shock of realizing how much they had endured without even realizing it. This was not what enemies were supposed to do. This was not how prisoners were supposed to be treated. When the water finally stopped, they wrapped themselves in towels, thick, dry, real towels. They stood there, wrapped and silent, unsure how to process what had just happened. No one rushed them. No one shouted. They were given clean clothes. As they left the shower room, something had changed. Not the war. Not their status. They were still prisoners. But something inside them had shifted. For the first time since the collapse of their world, they felt something dangerously close to relief. And relief, after years of suffering, was overwhelming. That single shower did not erase trauma. It did not undo loss. But it did something just as powerful. It reminded them. They were still human. And once that truth returned, it could never be fully taken away again. After the shower, the camp felt different. Nothing visible had changed. The fences were still there, the guards still watched, the rules still applied. And yet, the women walked differently. Their shoulders were straighter. Their eyes met the ground less often. Being clean had done more than restore their bodies. It had restored something quieter and more dangerous: awareness. They began to notice details they had ignored before. The guards addressed them without insults. Orders were firm but not cruel. Medical staff checked on the weak and the sick. Complaints, when voiced, were not punished, they were noted. This confused them. They had been raised on years of propaganda, just as Americans had been raised on their own. Each side had learned to see the other as monsters. But monsters were not supposed to provide soap or privacy or care. The women struggled with this contradiction. Some felt gratitude and immediately felt guilty for it. Gratitude toward an enemy felt like betrayal, of their suffering, of their dead, of everything they had been told to believe. Others resisted the kindness entirely, convinced it was temporary or strategic. War had trained them not to trust calm. Yet days passed and the pattern held. Food remained sufficient. Work assignments were fair. Punishments were rare and predictable, not arbitrary. Letters were discussed. Red Cross visits were mentioned. Slowly, cautiously, the women began to understand something unsettling. They were not being punished for losing the war. They were simply being held. This realization forced a painful comparison. Many thought of camps they had seen or heard about in Europe, places where prisoners were stripped, starved, and erased. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The question they avoided began to surface anyway. If this was how the enemy treated them, What did that say about the war itself? Some of the women felt anger rise, not at the Americans but at the lies they had lived under. Others felt shame. Not because they were prisoners but because they had expected cruelty so completely. Kindness did not erase responsibility. It did not rewrite history. But it complicated it. At night, conversations in the barracks changed. The tone softened. Fear no longer dominated every sentence. They spoke about the future, not with optimism but with the possibility of survival. And all of it traced back to that one moment. A shower. A simple act that said, "You are worth care even as a prisoner." The women understood now that war did not end when treaties were signed. It ended slowly, unevenly, sometimes in places as small as a tiled room filled with steam. They were still enemies on paper. But on a human level, something fragile had crossed the line. And once crossed, it could not be unseen. The women began to realize that this experience would stay with them long after the fences disappeared. Because it had changed not just how they saw their captors, but how they saw themselves. Years later, the women would remember that first shower, not as a trivial detail, but as a profound marker of survival and humanity. War had stripped them of nearly everything: homes, family, pride, certainty. Yet here, in a distant land, they were reminded that dignity could still exist, even in captivity. That small, ordinary acts, warm water, soap, privacy, could speak louder than violence or propaganda ever could. Some returned home to Germany. Others never saw their families again. Yet they carried this memory like a talisman, a quiet proof that the world could still recognize them as human. It reminded them that suffering was not a total erasure. That even in defeat, even as prisoners of a victorious enemy, they had been acknowledged, not merely managed. In interviews and memoirs decades later, they described the moment not with words of relief alone, but with a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and shame. Disbelief, because it seemed impossible that enemies could act with compassion. Gratitude, because for a moment the world felt bearable. Shame, because they had expected cruelty, and in receiving care, they had been confronted with the gap between expectation and reality. That shower became more than hygiene. It became a symbol. A reminder that humanity could survive even in the harshest conditions. That compassion, when extended across lines drawn by war, could quietly but permanently alter perceptions, relationships, and even the prisoner's sense of self. For historians, this story is a footnote, a minor episode in the vast chronicles of World War II. But for those women it was monumental. It shaped the way they remembered themselves, their captors, and the meaning of survival. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson, that even in moments of confinement, fear, and loss, the human capacity for care can create small miracles. Small miracles that ripple through memory, long after the war has ended, long after the barbed wire is gone, and long after history has moved on. Because some moments, unexpected, simple, profoundly human, never fade. And for those German women, that first shower in America would stay with them forever.